Hello, everybody here on stage 6. We are happy to have two brilliant speakers here for the next hour to spot on the Islam in the modern world and what's going on with social media and new techniques, new digital techniques. Let's give a very warm welcome to Saud Al-Zaid. He will talk to us about the unintended consequences of surveillance and the untold genesis of ISIS. So a very warm welcome to Saud.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It may be the defining event of the 21st century. When people think about Genesis or beginnings, they think about things like Gilgamesh or the story of Adam and Eve. But this is our very contemporary Genesis of something that we actually didn't spend too much time thinking about what it was called. But it was kind of like a feeling. It's something that we mark with ourselves in our own self-story. Where were you during 9/11? What was going on in your mind when you were seeing the towers collapse? And for most people, it didn't really matter. So the subsequent events after 9/11, even if you were in Lower Manhattan or you were in Northern Virginia, it really didn't matter where you were. But for some people, it really did matter where they were and what they were thinking and what they believed prior to this event. One of those people is Dick Cheney, the Vice President of the United States. This is him on the morning of 9/11, and we have these photos from the personal photographer of the Vice President's office, who just happened to be there that day and that morning. And he was watching speeches of his boss that he gave earlier in Florida, about educational reform or so what. And he was just having a regular morning. He was kicking back. He even put his feet up and just relaxing, and then boom. This is his 9/11 moment when he saw the first plane enter one of the Twin Towers. And you can just see him motionless. He doesn't move at all. He's just in complete shock, like all of us who had seen it at the time it was happening. Of course, he gets called in by his personal assistants, and he has to go down to the Situation Room. And in that point in time, his boss was famously or infamously reading to a group of elementary school children in Florida. And this is when he was told that the second tower hit. And he famously, this is the infamous point that he kept on with the class. He didn't want to disturb the children. It's very unclear, but you have to be, in a sense, a little sympathetic that he was in an elementary school full of mostly African-American children. And eventually he had to take over the classroom, of course, and be president. And yeah. Meanwhile, Dick Cheney is in the Situation Room, the basement of the White House, with Condoleezza Rice and the rest of the principals in the cabinet. And he was in charge, since he was the second in command, and the president was in transit. And the thoughts in their mind at this point defined so much till today. And I'm, in a sense, sympathetic to Dick Cheney because he worked in both of those buildings that were attacked. He used to work in the World Trade Center, and he used to work in the Pentagon as Secretary of Defense for many years. So in his mind, in the Situation Room, must be like, if I wasn't here, he could have been there. So it's a different way than just like how me and you see the picture. And as an ex-CEO of Halliburton, one of the largest logistics firms, and a previous Secretary of Defense, he has a different kind of understanding of war and the world than we do. And right now, I'm going to give you the shortest history of war in the 20th century. And this is the inheritance we had prior to September the 11th. We had the World Wars phase, which is basically World War I, which began with the assassination of Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo, So you had these crumbling empires and these kind of sovereign movements that were on the rise that wanted to be independent. Clearly, World War I was never really resolved, and that's why we had to do it all over again in World War II, with the rise of fascism in Germany and Italy, and these kind of nationalistic land grabs that happened. And I include the Holocaust in this phase because of the sheer exceptionality of human brutality, and because of the legacy of it that we still live today in the Palestinian-Israeli crisis. After the World Wars, the World War victors, the United States and USSR, had the Cold War. They never actually had a heated conflict, but they fought each other through proxy wars in Vietnam, and Korea, and Afghanistan. And after that, the official crumbling of the USSR, we have the post-Cold War phase, which we don't really have a name for, but it really began in the Yugoslav Civil War, which demonstrates that the conflict that began World War I in Sarajevo was still not resolved. This kind of tension between imperial, larger regional powers and individual nation states that wanted their own sovereignty. And in the post-Cold War phase, the most important conflict after that is Saddam's invasion of Kuwait. As a Kuwaiti, maybe some people would be thinking that I'm kind of biased to think of this as a very important event. I was a child as a refugee in Europe in 1990, so it's, in a sense, it's a very intimate conflict. But there are also other historical reasons why it is an important part of the understanding of radical Islam and radical Islamic movements. This is the first entire invasion of one country to the next since World War II. Since Hitler invaded Poland, and the last invasion was against Hungary in 1944. So all these conflicts that we had in the world prior to the establishment of the United Nations, these are all the neighboring nation states that went to war with each other. You never had one country completely invade the next, even when you had territorial disputes like in Kashmir, Palestine, or Western Sahara. Kuwait, in a sense, when Saddam rolled his tanks all the way to the Saudi border, this was the first time that has happened since Hitler invaded Hungary, when he thought that the Hungarians were going to switch sides. Or probably, maybe more accurately, like when Hitler invaded Poland, it said it was always part of the original country. And this is the picture of the oil fires after the invasion. So if you put yourself back in 1990 imagination, this guy was actually seen as kind of a hero in the Western point of view. Osama bin Laden was the American proxy against the Soviets in the Afghan jihad. Here's a picture of Ronald Reagan welcoming the Mujahideen into the Oval Office and kind of giving them all the support that they needed in terms of arms and material and political support. Back then, Al-Qaeda was, what was Al-Qaeda? Al-Qaeda was Qaeda Tanfidh in Arabic, translated as the base of operations, but it can also be translated as the base of administration. It is kind of like the rat house or the DMV. It is the bureaucracy of the jihad. And these were the guys who were actually issuing payments, figuring out logistics for training, and actually distributing kind of not just the charity aid from the Islamic world, but also the support that they were getting covertly from the CIA and the United States. And here, Saudi Arabia takes a massive leadership role, and bin Laden is the kind of the agent of Saudi Arabia in the Afghan jihad. His family comes from actually a Yemeni origin family, but they were a large contracting family in Saudi Arabia. And when people make the parallel sometimes between Saudi Arabia and ISIS, it's actually kind of, in a sense, not entirely accurate. It's very simplistic. It's kind of a facile argument to make, and it's also maybe sometimes a little racist, because there isn't one-to-one thing that, ISIS is from Saudi Arabia or vice versa. It's more like they're speaking within a sphere of discourse that is identical. And if you want to put like the blame or talk about these nationalistic terms for like assigning blame, then you should also look at Egypt. Because Egypt's socialist, semi-socialist regime for many years was highly oppressive to religious actors. And you see that in the partnership in Al-Qaeda between Ayman al-Zawahiri and bin Laden. And actually my doctoral work is specifically on the intellectual contribution of Egyptian intellectual thought. And it gets a lot more complicated, but it's about one of the main ideologues of the Muslim Brotherhood called Sayyid Qutb, who was in Jamal Abdel Nasser's prison for 16 years and was severely tortured. And during that time, he wrote a lot of material that tried to reimagine what Islam could be in the modern world. And his writings are, in a sense, the cornerstone for a lot of these political imagination of what the state could be. And particularly, it found an audience in these new states that were arising in the Gulf area, and specifically in the Najdi milieu, or the group of people that became in power in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Qatar. And because you see, these countries are being defined at precisely this interwar period, the conflicts that were going on around them, in terms of like the Cold War, were in a sense distant conflicts, but still had repercussions within their own imagination about how societies should be run and how independent and sovereignty looks like. And a lot of that is based on internal xenophobia and hierarchies among ethnic classes. And here, in a sense, when we go, like, Kuwait is critical in this narrative because of the fact that Malik Abdulaziz was in political exile as a teenager in Kuwait prior to establishing Saudi Arabia. And in a sense, it could have been absorbed within a larger Saudi frame, but it didn't, particularly because of this kind of heritage. Yeah, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, this is like an awful picture to wake up to, but he was born and raised in Kuwait, but because of his ethnic background, he isn't considered Kuwaiti. He's considered a stateless person. And the stateless issue is something that was kind of invented with the rise of the nation state and people having passports and citizenship and whatnot. And a lot of the political order that he was fighting against, he was using within the terminology of the legitimizing discourses of that order. And because of like this guy and Dick Cheney, we have the war on terror. It's basically the interaction between these two guys. And it's now at 1.3 million deaths. And this is only for Pakistan, Iraq, and Afghanistan up to 2013, so the number is definitely higher by now. It was a number issued by Physicians for Social Responsibility. And it doesn't include Syria, so the 500,000 is the estimate that is currently being put in place by the New York Times. Okay, so before 9/11, there was no real reason for animosity towards the United States. That if there is, it was definitely towards it being kind of an ally to Israel, but there was no, in a sense, direct attacks until 1993. In the first World Trade Center bombing, which was orchestrated by Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and his nephew, we see the first kind of aggression towards the United States, and it was largely an incompetent thing. No one got hurt. It was like a truck bombing. They clearly wanted to hurt people and they wanted it to collapse, but it was like not very successful in any stretch of the imagination. The vitriol increases in 1998 when they attack the US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, and embassy officials do die in that one. And here we see bin Laden is maybe slowly getting more involved, and this is exactly the time when Ayman al-Zawahiri and Osama bin Laden unify forces between the Egyptian jihadi groups and the Saudi jihadi groups. And this culminates in, prior to 2001, the last kind of attack that put even Al-Qaeda in the radar of the CIA and the NSA is the attack against the USS Cole in Yemen. And this is a military target, so it's something you would, in a sense, kind of expect. So, bad day at the office for both these gentlemen. And they've, this is, The genesis of ISIS is somewhere between these two guys. This resulted in a regime, this is especially the surveillance regimes when we're discussing about oppressive regimes and travel restrictions and searches, that there are two modes of operation that the United States government started exerting to the world at large, to whoever it perceived to be an enemy. And this is, the two modes can be described as cloak and dagger versus smoke and mirrors. And depending on which socioeconomic class you come from, what passport you hold, you'll be dealt with differently, depending on if you're a citizen of, say, Germany, or if you're a citizen of Yemen. Cloak and dagger is the military response to the aggression. It's very based on the language of effectiveness. It's based on being quick and taking out the enemy. And this was the original invasion of Afghanistan, could be framed in those terms. Smoke and mirrors, on the other hand, is all about like perceptions, and it's about how you feel when you're entering a country and exiting. It's being constantly questioned at points of entry. What do you believe? What do you think? They want to, in a sense, have an idea of who you are as an individual and what do you like, what's your threat assessment? Like, how threatening are you as a person? And the way that they do these sort of general styles of interacting with the outside world or the perceived enemy, the official military way to distribute blame and how to, in a sense, utilize resources is through the Joint Task Force, which is rhetoric from the US Navy from like the 1960s when they used missions of several branches of the military cooperating. And the intelligence failure of 9/11, no one was fired. No one was fired in the CIA immediately after 9/11. What they did was like, the FBI and the CIA were not talking to each other because the FBI were in charge of the 1993 investigation. And because of this, this was the mistake that could have caught it, so they made the Joint Terrorism Task Force. Which was a very confusing administrative thing that who was, in a sense, in charge of it. The FBI eventually got control of it through the Justice Department. But when you ever enter into the rhetoric of joint task forces, you're in the world of patches. You have these kind of military patches that tells you, and you can just look at the imagery here, like the terrorists with the shotgun, and more importantly, all the abbreviations of the different branches of the military or the US government that are in charge. So IRS, INS, etc. So even Guantanamo is technically a joint task force. It's not like there's no one branch of the military that's entirely in charge. It's distributed across several commands. And you can see, even just from their website, the kind of anxieties that they have: safe, humane, legal, transparent. Yeah, and especially the insignias in the bottom. So you see them planting trees, doing they have mini golf apparently in Guantanamo. The other thing that the security regimes have done is that they've privatized large chunks of things that usually militaries are in charge of, and the private military and security contractors. The primary reason behind doing this is like if you actually look at theorists of military, of armies and wars, the use of mercenaries, which is effectively, these guys are effectively mercenaries, shows that there is a lack of unit cohesion, that there is some part of the established military establishment that isn't working. And when you see the critical apparatus that is becoming privatized, it makes you a little uneasy. So even Guantanamo is heavily privatized, for instance. And some of the companies that initially joined are not the ones that get a lot of attention from the press and the media, and especially the subsidiaries of Halliburton, like Kellogg Brown and Root, which is in charge of some facets of Guantanamo, and G4S, which is actually a British company, which puts the sovereignty question in my mind really kind of in sharp relief. Like, who is in charge if there's like a foreign corporation that is doing kind of the services that you don't want to do? And of course, contractors have been cited in abuses in both Guantanamo and in Abu Ghraib and other prisons. But here's the part where it gets a little even more messy, is that these private contractors possibly trained the forces that eventually became the Islamic State. This is during the beginnings of the Arab Spring, when they were training the moderate Islamic rebels against Bashar al-Assad. And here's, like, it's one of those things like Abu Amr al-Shaychani was almost definitely trained by Blackwater. Yeah, it's the same. And here's like the sheer irony. So the Blackwater founder, Eric Prince, is saying, we could have fought ISIS if Obama hadn't crushed my old business. Well, yeah, maybe, yeah, that isn't entirely accurate. And another part of the contractor line of work is actually recreating security regimes that were utilized in the United States. And the United States is one of the largest prison countries that has the largest prison population in the world. And these establishments of prisons in Iraq, in the countries that they were in control of during the war on terror, this is Camp Bucca in Iraq, and where a lot of the minds that became ISIS actually met here in person first. And Bucca is actually named after Ronald Bucca, who is a firefighter who died in the World Trade Center. And this is his name in the World Trade Center Memorial. He was one of like the big guys in the fire department in New York. And this is something that is widely acknowledged, that America, in a sense, helped ISIS to happen, not intentionally, but unintentionally, because of this kind of prison where they just rounded up military-aged men and to check out what their affiliations were in terms of terrorist groups and whatnot. And this is al-Baghdadi, and he was an inmate before he became the Caliph al-Baghdadi. And to the point that the absurdity of the military contractors, we're talking the Iraq war so far has cost 1.1 trillion. Of that, an estimated third has gone to private military contracts, which is a ridiculous sum and hard to even audit. If you wanted to go in and look at where the money went, it's almost impossible because you have these subsidiaries and you have these contractors going on to other contractors. And now we've reached a point where we even have non-profit or military contractors, which is like kind of an insane concept. They have like a show in the History Channel that these guys are mercenaries acting like a non-profit, which... in this environment where things are privatized and things that are uncomfortable are given away to both private companies and to these ambiguous administrative entities, I want to talk about like real-life examples. How does that actually work out to individual Muslims who eventually become ISIS? And Mohammed Amwazi is someone who... I gave a talk about him in Kuwait, and he was killed by a drone strike the next day. So I have a kind of a troubled history with him, because every time I thought I figured out what was going on with his story, someone kind of surprises me and I discover something new. He's the guy who's famous as being as Jihadi John, one of the primary executioners of the Islamic State. But prior to him becoming Jihadi John, and the reason he's called Jihadi John is because the terrorist cell that he was a part of had such thick British accents that they called them the Beatles. So yeah, he's like the John Lennon of the Beatles. But prior to that, he was actually kind of a dorky kid, from all the reports that I've heard. In high school, immediately after high school, he went on a safari in Tanzania. And at that time, he was accused by British intelligence as being tried to make contact with Al-Shabaab, but apparently there's not a lot of truth to that story. And MI6 or MI5 wanted to pressure him to be an informant for them, because he also actually, he was born and raised, sorry, he was born in Kuwait and lived most of his life in the United Kingdom. But he was actually a stateless person from Kuwait, so he has kind of this ambiguous and awful status. And after he was interrogated quite harshly, he went to an NGO called CAGE, which was established by Muazzam Beg, who was a former Guantanamo inmate who was released and then proven to have no connection to terrorism whatsoever. And he told them that he received like a very harsh treatment from British intelligence, and they believe that this is what radicalized him. And because he failed to cooperate, the story is very ambiguous. It's very kind of unclear how he was treated and who actually interrogated him. He was deported to Syria at the beginning of the conflict, like literally, because this was the only country that would take him. And so he entered ISIS in a sense, kind of by happenstance and by deportation regime. which is awful. And by all accounts, when he was living in England, he was just a regular kid and kind of on the dorky side. There are all these videos of him like so nervous about his halitosis that when he talks to anyone, he like covers his mouth. And it shows you, because of his stateless status, he ended up in ISIS, is my kind of diagnosis. And in this kid's case, he's lucky that he had an American passport, that the same fate didn't end up to him. But I can imagine a scenario where things could have escalated, that he gets deported and his parents get deported. San Bernardino is another one of those sort of, like how relevant are they to the stuff that's going on to the Middle East? And it's actually one of these things that you guys are probably going to find surprising. Sayyid Rahil Farook and his wife Tashfeen, the infamous San Bernardino shooters, and apparently ISIS, and the big controversy about unlocking their phone, they met on an internet dating site for South Asian couples with disabilities and people who wanted to get remarried. This is something that people don't talk about in the press about the event. So they had a disability, sorry, I brushed. That there was something about their relationship that we just don't completely understand, and it has probably nothing to do with his cell phone. The idea of a husband and wife team committing terrorism is not something that is standard within the terrorism narrative, or something that would be approved of by Orthodox Islamic practice. It's actually an invention of like the world of Jack Bauer. This is like the characters in 24 when you have like the really steely mom who, the jihadi family. This is completely an invention. We have no like real life evidence of having like a husband and wife team. And I think it's very appropriate that it happened in the LA area, because this is an American problem. It's not really a Middle Eastern or an Islamic problem, so to speak. In Orthodox Islam, the female jihadists is actually very prescribed that women in the battlefield are a support staff to the men, and they provide water and first aid. And the one exceptional situation in Islam where a woman actually fought, the exceptionality of the story, Amara, Nusayba bint Ka'b, she defended the Prophet when his security detail collapsed. So it was a very kind of particular situation where women were allowed to fight, and it's only under very exceptional circumstances that they are encouraged to, carry the sword. This is entirely a product of Hollywood. And I think the San Bernardino attack should be seen in those terms. It's actually, something that's more interesting than Rizwan is his brother Farook, Rahil Farook. Rahil Farook, is seen here with his lawyer, was actually in the US Navy, and he served in Iraq from 2003 to 2007. And he earned 2 medals on the global war on terrorism. And I tried to research, like, how did he get these medals, what was going on, and I wasn't getting a response from anyone. And what is actually probably even more interesting than his Navy experience is his wife, which he also met on the internet. Tatiana Charnych is from Russia, apparently. And the story even gets a little weirder. Her parents live in Israel, and her sister is also in the United States. This is Maria and Tatiana. And she is married, or in a sham marriage, with Enrique Marquez, the only person who was charged with providing logistical support to the San Bernardino shooters. So the guns that they used, they got from this guy. And apparently it wasn't a real marriage, because Maria has 2 children with another guy. So it's kind of, in a sense, a very weird and convoluted situation. And their low profile, disappeared once, like, the case went out. And I don't want to overly speculate, but it seems like that there's more than meets the eye to what happened in San Bernardino. It probably doesn't have to do so much with the original shooters. I think the best way to understand San Bernardino is that Rahil and Rizwan's father kind of was an abusive alcoholic. Rizwan and Tashfeen clearly had debilitating mental illnesses, and they left a 5-year-old baby behind. So I think a possible postpartum depression, some sort of psychotic break, was the actual kind of way we should look at San Bernardino, and not so much as about an ISIS or the civilizational battle. They are more a product of this kind of paranoid behavior that surrounded them. And there's something that doesn't add up with Rahil and Enrique's stories. So that's kind of another, yeah. Wrapping up, what we see, like the real kind of collapse between the smoke and mirrors and the cloak and dagger, a minute, 2 minutes, is Anwar al-Awlaki's case, the guy who was killed by a drone strike. Anwar al-Awlaki, I knew him in DC. I lived in DC, and he was a preacher in Northern Virginia, as the crazy conspiracy theory imam. That he didn't think like that Muslims were actually behind 9/11, that this was actually the CIA to make the. It turns out like he was a sex addict, and the FBI actually knew about his sex addiction, and they tried to manipulate him through that. And there's a great book about it by Scott Shane called Objective Troy, and I still think Awlaki's kind of principle is that you don't reach out to a sheikh or to any of your buddies in the mosque in order to commit terror. You should just do it. That is like the Awlaki principle. And this is, in a sense, what ISIS has become, is because of these extensive surveillance regimes that people are just going to operate as free, like as free-reigning terrorists. And this is what happened in Fort Hood. And I think I'm going to leave you with like words remain words unless they are acted upon and implemented by Awlaki. And yeah, this is him. And the real kind of tragedy, I guess I'm going to end on a tragic note, is that his son died as well. So, okay. Thank you, everyone. And yeah, if you have any questions, you can ask me later.